You said it always looks like we haven't innovated in 10 or 20 years because it takes 10 or 20 years before innovation is an obvious success. So just like we can't predict the bad things, we also can't predict the good things. If you had asked someone in 1970 what in 2000 or 2020 the biggest innovation is, there's no way someone would have talked about an iPhone or maybe the internet, but it would be very unlikely for people to understand the size and the scope of it. So it's just fascinating how it works both ways. We just don't know.
Yeah, and even when we kind of get it right, we're still often very wrong. So if you went back to 1999 and you said, what's going to be big in the internet? And someone might say search advertising is going to be big. And you're like, oh, you were right. You're totally right about that. So who are you picking as a winner? And they'd be like AOL, Ask Jeeves, and Yahoo. Those are going to be the three winners. You're like, no, it didn't really work out. So even when you get it right, the people are still usually wrong in hindsight. The other example of this is like if you go back to the early 2000s or the early 1900s, I should say, there were 2,000 car companies in America, and 1,997 of them went bankrupt. The three that were left, GM, Ford, and Chrysler, two of which went bankrupt themselves eventually. So it's like even when you see a trend that's like this is the next big trend, and you're right about it, actually making money from that is exponentially more difficult. And the odds of you pulling it off are still so slim.
What about airplanes? What they said about airplanes in the early 1900s as well. Just like, oh, there's no shot.
And the big thing about this, which is true, this is true for so many new inventions, is that the first iteration of a new invention is usually far inferior to the status quo. So when the cars came about, horses were much better. They were way more reliable. They could go longer distances. They were like everything about the horse was better than the car. And when the plane came about, the train was better in every aspect. Planes could go very short distances. They crashed all the time. They were like, there were so many things about like trains and ships were way better than planes. And it might not be true. Like when the internet first came about, like using a phone to call your grandma was probably better in the early days. It was probably faster and more reliable, and it made more sense. So every new iteration, even in hindsight, if you're like, oh, the plane is going to be huge, the car is going to be huge, even in hindsight when you know it's right, it's still like, I don't blame people for belittling a new technology because it's true that the first iterations are inferior.
What today are we looking at as inferior and in 20 years is going to be something that's more obvious and widespread? An incredibly difficult and impossible question based on everything we spoke about. But if you had to guess, what comes to mind?
Put me on the spot here. I don't. God, that's a good question. I remember not that long ago, 5 or 6 years ago, there was a VC, a pretty prominent VC, who said the next big thing is going to be chatbots. I can see it. Chatbots are the thing. And I remember a year later, 2 years later, 3 years later, 5 years later, I was like, what a moron. That never happened. And then ChatGPT came out a month ago and I was like, maybe he was right. Maybe he was totally right. So there's things like that. I have no idea what the next big thing is going to be, but that to me was a perfect example of like, as of 2 months ago, I thought this person was clearly wrong. And as of today, I'm like, maybe they were onto it.